Welcome back to part 3 of our look at the skeletal system. In this video we will be focusing more on the structure of bone, which will largely be a review of what we've looked at already in lab. And so if you recall from lab, there are two structural classifications of bone. We have dense or compact bone, what we typically see associated with long bones. And so we're dealing with the shaft, or that elongated portion of the bone. And in infants, toddlers, children, adolescents, we find red bone marrow within the shaft of the long bones within that area of compact bone. And then we know that as that individual matures and enters into their younger or early 20s, that red bone begins to convert over into yellow bone marrow. And so it moves from that process of hematopoiesis or erythrocyte production to being a reservoir of adipocytes and having high amounts of adipose tissue within that marrow. And then we know that we also have spongy bone. We've looked at spongy bone from the perspective of looking at vertebrae, but we also have spongy bone in flat bones, things such as the scapula, things such as the cranial bones, the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the sphenoid bone, and the occipital bone, within the sternum, within the ribs, within the coxal bone, within the clavicle. And so all of those bones that would be more defined as being flat bones, we have red bone marrow, as well as the distal ends, or the distal and the proximal ends of our long bones. We also contain that red bone marrow. So we're going to look at this structural organization of that bone in a little bit more detail. Again, this will largely be a review of what we've already looked at and talked about. And so here we see spongy bone first. We already know that the spongy bone is made up of these ridges or these plates of bone. And so this area right in here, that is more of the pink stained tissue. That is your trabecular bone. Another term that you might see there is spicule bone. So either trabeculae or spicule bone are both interchangeable, as well as spongy bone. And it gets that name, spongy, because of these hollowed out spaces that are between these ridges of trabecular bone. And what is located within the empty spaces, or these hollowed spaces between the trabecular bone, is where we find the red bone marrow. And so you're looking at, and here you're looking at that red bone marrow, and you can see that that is pointed out and indicated here with the pen. So we've got our red bone marrow here, and we have our trabecular bone indicated there. And on this slide, we have what you probably did not pay attention to in lab when we were going through the skeletal system, and that is the organization or the arrangement of the cranial bones, which again are a type of flat bone. And what we see with this is we see a outer covering of that bone over here, and then we see an inner covering or an internal plate of compact bone right here, and sandwiched in between that internal and external plate of compact bone, we have an area of spongy bone. And this image down here is simply a blown up area of one small region of that trabecular bone as an example of spongy bone. And so you can see where all of these hollowed spaces are located. This is where the red bone marrow would be located, and so all of that would be areas of erythrocyte production. From a structural perspective, we refer to that area of spongy bone as being the diploe, and so you can see that listed right there. Now, that's kind of a rough overview. Again, this is largely a review of what we've already looked at. On this slide, what we're actually seeing here is we're seeing the two more common types of bones, that being your long bones and your flat bones, as well as the two more infrequent bones, what we would define as being short bones or irregular bones. By definition, long bones are longer than they are wider, and so things like your metacarpals, your metatarsals, your proximal, medial, and distal phalanges, your femur, humerus, radius, ulna, tibia, and fibula would all be examples of long bones. Your flat bones would be, again, bones that are more flat in appearance. They're made up of that trabecular bone, which is sandwiched between those external and internal layers of compact bone. Short bones, by definition, are wider than they are longer, and so your carpals, your tarsals would be example of short bones, and your irregular bones are really bones that don't fit into any of those other three categories. And so your vertebrae would be an example of irregular bones. And on this slide here, we're simply seeing some examples of the long bones. Right, so here the humerus would be an example. Again, example of your flat bone, this being your sternum. Both the manubrium and the body of the sternum, and the xiphoid process. Again, an irregular bone here would be an example of that would be your vertebrae. In this case here we have a lumbar vertebrae. And an example of a short bone here would be the talus. Your long bones are divided up into two very specific areas or regions. The diaphysis is what is also referred to as the shaft of any long bone, and you can see that that takes up largely the area where the medullary canal would be located. And that medullary canal, or that cavity, is where we would find either the red bone marrow in infants and toddlers and children and adolescents, or it's where we would find the yellow bone marrow in adults. And on the ends, I'll give you a little different of a color here. On the ends of our long bones, again, this would be the proximal end, this would be the distal end, is where we would have spongy bone. And you can see right here, you can see that spongy bone that is present right here. Also notice that we have this additional line right here. Below it and above it, we've got spongy bone. But you've got this line, this epiphyseal plate. Don't lose sight of that term. The epiphyseal plate, or the epiphyseal line. You guys very much often refer to that as being the growth plate. Now that growth plate in juveniles is actually made of hyaline cartilage. And we're going to talk more about this later because this is involved in bone lengthening. But as you mature, as you start hitting the height of puberty, that epiphyseal plate actually will ossify. So it'll go from being hyaline cartilage to being compact bone. And it's at that point in time that bone lengthening ends. Again, we will come back to that here in actually the fourth PowerPoint for this topic. Here we see a breakdown of our compact bone into two distinct areas. Think back to that model that we looked at in lab, the model that looked very much like this right here, right, where on the outer edge you had your periosteum, right, and then the inner lining, what would actually line the medullary canal, we have that structure called the endosteum. And that's what you're seeing right here. Right, so the periosteum actually is subdivided into two layers. The deep layer, which contains osteoprogenitor cells to allow that that bone, that compact bone, to go ahead and rejuvenate itself. And then the superficial layer, the outermost layer, which is made up of dense, irregular connective tissue to allow for the attachment of ligaments when we are creating a joint connecting bone to bone, and allows for the connection of tendons when we're talking about the attachment of muscle to that bone. And then that inner layer, that deep layer, the endosteum, actually does not have any connective tissue, but it is made up of osteoprogenitor cells that helps to remodel and rebuild, break down, and build the trabecular bone, or that spongy bone. Right? So once again, the outer area, right, the outer area is the periosteum. Right? That's what you're seeing right here, kind of peeled back. And that periosteum is made up of a superficial layer, which is dense, irregular connective tissue, as well as a deeper layer that is made up of osteoprogenitor cells for the generation of new bone, and then that innermost layer that lines the medullary canal, which is made up of spongy bone or trabecular bone. Again, that's lacking that layer of connective tissue, but it does have osteoprogenitor cells that allows for the formation of new bone. And again, this slide here is one that we've already looked at, but I do want to reiterate the structure, the organization of flat bones. Again, you have that external plate and the internal plate, which is made up of compact bone, and then that area in between, the compact bone and so here's where the external plate would end. And so from here down to that area right there is where we would go ahead and identify this area right here is where we would identify the spongy bone, structurally referred to as the diploe. And so we're going to stop here. I'm going to let you digest this information, kind of go back and review this, answer your questions as a review, and we'll see you for the fourth video, which is going to look at the process of osteogenesis, the formation and the rebuilding or remodeling of bone.